Welcome to our ICONIS event in New Scholarship Showcase. This is a monthly virtual event of the ICONIS Committee on New Directions in Scholarship, where we discuss new books in public law. My name is Barihun Gabaye, and I'm a member of the committee and a lecturer in law at Faculty of Laws, University College London. Today, we will be discussing a new book by Professors Asla Bali and Omar Dajani, titled Federalism and Decentralization is a Contemporary Middle East and North Africa, published with Cambridge University Press in 2023. With us, we have both the editors of the book and I will introduce them in a bit. Asla Bali is professor of law at Yale Law School, where she teaches international law, international human rights law, and third world approaches to international law. Previously, she was a professor at the UCLA School of Law, where she was founding faculty director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights and director of the UCLA Center for Near Eastern Studies. She is also president-elect of the Middle East Studies Association of North America. Her scholarship has appeared in numerous law and peer-reviewed social science journals, including Chicago Journal of International Law, Cornell International Law Journal, International Journal of Constitutional Law, University of Chicago Law Review, Geopolitics, Law and Social Inquiry, Theory and Event, UCLA Law Review, Vanderbilt Journal of Transnational Law, Virginia Journal of International Law, and Yale Journal of International Law, among many others. And she's also the co-editor of 2 volumes addressing different facets of institutional design and comparative constitutional law from Cambridge University Press. Professor Omar Dajani is a co-director of the Global Center for Business and Development at McGeorge School of Law. He's recognized as a leading expert on legal aspects of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. He began his legal career by clerking for Judge Dorothy Nelson on the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, and working as a litigation associate at the Washington, D.C. Office of Sidley and Austin. In 1999, Professor Dajani was recruited to serve as a legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team in peace talks with Israel, ultimately participating in the summit at Camp David in Taba. He then joined the Office of the United Nations, a special coordinator for the Middle East peace process, where he worked on peace-building initiatives and played a lead role in marshalling and organizing international efforts to support Palestinian legal and political reforms. Professor Dajani has continued since that time to work as a consultant on a variety of legal infrastructure development and conflict resourcing projects in the Middle East and elsewhere for institutions such as the US Department of State, the Norwegian Peacebuilding Resource Center, and the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, among many others. We are also joined by 2 distinguished discussants, Professor Vicky Jackson and Professor Madhav Khosla, who are well known to our audience here and genuinely need no introduction, but it's customary that we introduce our panelists. Vicky Jackson is a Lawrence H. Tribe Professor of Constitutional Law at Harvard Law School. She writes and teaches about US constitutional law, federal courts, and comparative constitutional law. She is author of many books. I will simply mention some of them, including Constitutional Engagement in a Transnational Era, and co-author of Comparative Constitutional Law, which is a source book in the field. She has written several edited volumes, just to mention a few: Comparative Constitutional Law, Proportionality, New Frontiers, New Challenges, and Constitutionalism Across Borders in the Struggle Against Terrorism. She has written on a number of topics such as federalism, gender equality, election law, free speech, knowledge institutions, sovereign immunity, and methodological challenges in comparative constitutional law, among several topics. And she's also on the advisory board of several journals and associations. Madhav Khosla is an associate professor of law at Columbia University. He's interested in the nature and form of constitutions, especially from a comparative and theoretical perspective, with a special focus on South Asia and India. He studied political theory at Harvard, where his dissertation was awarded the Edward M. Chaz Prize for the best dissertation on a subject related to the promotion of world peace, and law at Yale Law School and the National Law School of India University, Bangalore. Before joining Columbia, he was a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows, and he's also the author of the India's Founding Moment, the Constitution of a Most Surprising Democracy, published with Harvard University Press in 2020, which was an economist-based book of 2020 and co-winner of the Order of the Coif Book Award in 2021. He's also the co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of the Indian Constitution and Unstable Constitutionalism, Law and Politics in South Asia. This is simply, in addition, his writings have been published in several journals, such as the American Journal of Comparative Law, Harvard Law Review, and the International Journal of Constitutional Law. And he writes for popular forums such as The Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, New York Times, and The Times. And his works has been cited by courts both in India and Pakistan. And I could talk about the profile and the bios of our discussants today for an hour, but I think we have an important book to discuss. And thank you all for joining us. So we will start the discussion with a brief presentation by Asla and Omar. They will introduce the main themes and motivations of the book, followed by comments from our two discussants, and then from a response from the editors. And then we will have a Q&A session. For members of the audience, you can use either the chat or raise hand function to ask questions. Now it is time to hear from the authors. Asla, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Berihun, for the generous introductions. So I just wanted to begin maybe by situating our project, which, as the title indicates, is on federalism and decentralization in the Middle East and North Africa. We're interested in the contemporary period and specifically the aftermath of the Arab uprisings, which began in 2010, 2011, and the counter-revolutions and civil conflict that ensued following the uprisings. They coincided with a time in which much of the world was marking the centenary of a set of treaties at the end of World War I that shaped the modern Middle East. And those centenaries occasioned a series of debates publicly in the United States and in Europe about whether or not the instability, purported instability of the Middle East and North Africa might be attributed to borders which had been misaligned, essentially by imperial powers that were artificial in some sense, and whether or not it wouldn't make more sense to establish new borders in the region as a conflict resolution device in order to have more ethnically homogenous entities or ethno-sectarian homogeneity within borders in the region. And that set of proposals, coinciding as they did with the aftermath of the Arab uprisings, marked the beginning of a conversation between myself and Omar Dajani, the two of us as co-editors of this volume, in part because we both rejected that prescription, at least aspects of it, noting obviously that setting new borders is an invitation, amongst other things, to ethnic cleansing, and that indeed a century later, the same, those who are engaging in these debates in Washington and New York and London and Paris were no better situated, indeed, arguably much worse situated even than the imperial map makers a century earlier to determine what would be in the best interest of the populations of the territory. But the question did emerge, what's the alternative? If not new borders, then what? How might one address both the demands for improved governance and the demands for self-determination and greater autonomy that were evident across the region? And this led us to the question of what decentralization might mean for a region in which overweening security apparatuses, concentrations of power in the executive, and frustrated demands for self-determination amongst the stateless communities within those borders have become a common post-colonial experience across the region. So the question of decentralization in the Middle East and North Africa has occupied us for some well over 5 years in trying to answer those sets of questions that first emerged in that period. And what we noticed from the outset in trying to study this issue is that while decentralization is amongst the most advocated reforms globally, particularly as part of neoliberal packages promoted by international financial institutions, including in the Middle East and North Africa, there's almost no scholarship or extremely little scholarship on decentralizing experiences that are specific to this particular region. And this, again, is in part a reflection of the ways in which the Middle East and North Africa are, relatively speaking, understudied in the comparative law and comparative politics literatures, respectively. There are many exceptions in the sense of excellent single case country studies of questions of decentralization and constitutional design that pick up on some of the themes that we're interested in, but very few comparative studies. There is one by a Lebanese think tank on decentralization initiatives in Lebanon, Morocco, Tunisia, and Yemen from the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies that was authored by Mona Harb and Sami Attallah. And for those of you who take a look at our edited volume, you'll see that they are also authors of a chapter in our volume. And that was really the only thing when we first began that had been written that was specifically a comparative inquiry around decentralization in particular, that was more than a single case country study on the region. Since then, there have been a couple of more recent publications, 2 separate volumes on federalism in the region that we think are suggestive of the intensity of interest in the subject that we've engaged, but by no means exhaustive at all of all that there is to be said about decentralization and federalism in the region. And so our book attempts to fill what we think is a quite significant gap in these literatures, and it's of course only a first step. But in attempting to do that, we thought really an edited volume was the best approach because of the incredible diversity and range of state experiences with decentralization and federalism in the Middle East and North Africa, and the importance from our perspective of empirically grounded, deep understandings, thick description of what's happening in these various contexts, combined with an interest in genuine comparative theorizing. And so to achieve this, we thought we would invite a mix of theoretical chapters, which comprise the first part of our book, and then deep case studies by authors largely located within the countries that they are studying. And the book includes contributions from a group that is diverse in national origin, including scholars and practitioners from Iran, Iraq, Israel, Palestine, Libya, and Tunisia, as well as from the US and Europe, and diverse in terms of discipline, including law, political science, political theory, history, sociology, and urban planning, amongst others. And these studies, the theoretical chapters and the empirical case studies, provided us as editors the opportunity to really take a broad survey and try to draw on it to develop a synthetic conclusion that really affords the possibility of empirically grounded theorizing about what is happening and what we can learn and what is generalizable from the experience with decentralization and federalism in the region. The contributions of the book include, in our view, the widest range of case studies of the region that's available in any volume that we're aware of, including not only the Arab world, any volume on the Middle East and North Africa, including not only the countries of the Arab world, but also Turkey, Iran, and Israel, Palestine, brought into comparative analysis with the countries of the Arab world. Enormous attention to what is distinctive about the political and historical context of the region, together with some traits that are common to the global South more generally, which we think really do provide a basis for greater generalization or generalizability of some of the lessons that we draw from our consideration of these cases. And a decision to think about decentralization and federalism together, the ways in which competing agendas around measures that seek to improve governance through decentralization and those that seek to afford a measure of self-determination through territorial pluralism and federalism actually are often intertwined in the Middle East and North Africa, but also in the global South more generally, even though in the literatures that we engaged with, typically either one or the other is addressed, as was exemplified by the other volumes on the Middle East that I mentioned earlier, either decentralization for governance purposes or federalism and territorial pluralism are the object of study. The two taken together are rarely engaged, and so the interaction effects between them are less well theorized. The rest of our time is going to be spent discussing some of our core arguments and conclusions. But before I turn to that, I just want to say a couple of more words about the distinctive political and historical context of the Middle East and North Africa that makes a volume like this meaningful in our view, despite the very wide range of experiences from North Africa to Iran that we're encompassing. The first is that the vast majority of states that we're looking at were states that were part of the Ottoman domain until the 20th century and have a shared set of legacies of governance experiences that predate the colonial encounter with Europe, and have set certain kinds of path-dependent patterns that we think are relevant to understanding the sort of course of decentralization and federalism in the region. So in these countries, and the exceptions in our book to those that were within the Ottoman Empire are only Morocco and Iran. All other cases in the book were indeed drawn from Ottoman territories. They were all governed historically, literally for millennia, in a highly decentralized manner, where capitals and major urban centers had wide provincial peripheries, were governed by local notables, and there was little centralized governance apart from some fiscal apparatus, common court structures, but in a context of significant legal pluralism, and then a territory-wide defense force that was primarily designed to defend the boundaries of the empire rather than impose security within it. This is until the middle of the 19th century, when the encounter with European nationalisms came to be understood by the Ottoman governing class, as well as by provincial leaders, as a project for partitioning the empire. And the response to this was to centralize control and bolster the security apparatus of the state in anticipation of European incursions, and to treat ethno-sectarian difference as a source of anxiety about separatism, disrupting the much longer history of coexistence in the region under decentralized arrangements. This establishes a path-dependent pattern of response to centrifugal forces through centralization and investment in security services that we think explains in part the reasons why decentralization has been experienced both as a recurring demand from the bottom up in the region and also as a source of enormous anxiety and fear of divide and rule strategies, which strategies were realized in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, when the mandates for the Ottoman territories did indeed engage in literal partitions, carving out countries like Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine from Greater Syria, and undermining goals for post-Ottoman Arab unification. Beyond the Ottoman context, Iran and Morocco also had similar experiences of European pressures resulting in centralization. And so long histories of de facto federalism and decentralization gave way across the region that we study to intense periods of centralization and then state formation that followed the same pattern: centralized control, anxieties about ethno-sectarian difference and diversity, and investment in security apparatuses in a defensive manner. This historical backdrop, some of which shares common features with other parts of the post-colonial global South, suggests two key things to us. First, that there are longstanding existing indigenous traditions of decentralization and de facto forms of federal arrangements that remain available scripts for explaining, legitimizing, and justifying these strategies across the region. And second, that deep post-colonial anxieties about decentralization, understood as a strategy of dismemberment or to undermine territorial integrity, equally recur and are available to the central states of the region to resist either decentralizing or federalist reform agendas from the bottom up. So I'm going to just turn quickly to Omar after making a couple of more. Actually, you know what? I think I'm going to turn to Omar here to take us through some of the contributions and specifically some of the arguments that we lay out in the body of our synthetic conclusion.
So thanks very much, Asla. In addition to grappling with the implications of the historical experience that Asla just discussed, the volume makes, in our view, two additional important contributions. First, it offers a snapshot of the discourse about federalism and decentralization at a particular and particularly consequential moment in time. That is, for the most part, the period just preceding and during the Arab uprisings of the last decade. One notable exception to that being the Iranian case, which focuses on an earlier period, but addresses, as you'll read, some very similar themes and dynamics. Second, although we were careful to avoid what's just been described as the facile institutional recommendations that have guided a lot of policy in this field, the volume offers a range of empirically grounded insights that we believe can inform both continuing work on the region and also comparative analysis. So one of the striking features of the period that our cases focus on is how broad-based the support for decentralizing government was across the countries of the region, even as mere mention of the word federalism was a source of acrimony due to some extent to the historical experience that Asla laid out a little earlier. So in Iran, in Iraq, in Morocco, Syria, Tunisia, Yemen, and also in countries outside the book's scope, such as Egypt and Jordan, we hear calls for decentralization, both from within regimes and also from reform movements with varying ideological commitments. Often decentralizing government is the only governance-related reform that they all agree on. And that's a dynamic that's especially richly painted by the book's chapters on Iran and Tunisia. And as we can perhaps discuss a little further today, it seems unlikely that we would encounter the same consensus today, the fallout from the uprisings having yielded greater anxiety about centrifugal dynamics, and with it, a greater appetite for strong centralized rule in some quarters than was present a little more than a decade ago. But that said, the broad support for decentralization documented in our cases does highlight the elasticity of the concept. And that elasticity has made decentralization both an easy slogan to embrace and also something that was easy to deploy opportunistically. And that brings me to one of the important insights of the volume, that decentralizing measures are championed by a broader array of actors and driven by a broader array of motivations than the literature has so far acknowledged. The long prevalent typology defined by Alfred Stepan more than 20 years ago focused on federal systems and identified three ideal types, what he called coming together, holding together, and putting together systems. But as we began examining the discourse about decentralization and federalism in the MENA region, we found that typology of limited value, either as a means of describing what was motivating interest in decentralizing government in the region, or for explaining the choices that were being made by political actors about how to design political institutions. So it seemed necessary to us to juxtapose a fuller array of forms of decentralized governance, as Asla earlier mentioned, examining both federal and unitary systems of government rather than focusing only on one or the other, and also to consider both governance-related and identity-related decentralizing initiatives in tandem. And third, we tried to be attentive to the different kinds of political actors driving development of the systems of governments in the countries we were studying. These choices were driven in part by our recognition that the configuration of political authority tends to be determined over the course of protracted negotiation processes in this region, sometimes stretching over decades, in which different kinds of political actors bargain regarding which powers and how much power will be devolved from the central government to subnational governments. The history that we see recounted in our chapters on Syria and Iraqi Kurdistan does a great job of exemplifying the protracted, even perennial character of these processes. And in a number of our cases, including Libya, Syria, Yemen, and Western Sahara, Morocco, we see contexts where there is a demand made for a federal system or for some robust asymmetric autonomy that is then met with an offer for more limited forms of political or administrative decentralization. And so by looking at federalism and other forms of decentralization together, it was possible for us to paint a more complete picture of these dynamics. And that brings me to the last thing I'll say before turning back to Asla, which is, as we tried to distill all of this into a typology, what we undertook to do was really to draw from the experience laid out in the volume. And we found that decentralized government had been advocated or implemented in pursuit of six types of strategies, themselves in tension with one another. So We see it implemented as a bulwark against authoritarian reversion, with limited success in Tunisia, Iraq, and Yemen, and at the same time as an instrument for consolidating authoritarian rule in, for example, Iran, Morocco, and Syria. We see it as a vehicle for emancipating long oppressed identity groups, as in Syrian Kurdistan, or an attempt is made in Israel-Palestine, and at the same time as a vehicle for diverting identity groups from meaningful self-determination, as through the Oslo framework in Israel-Palestine and advanced regionalization in Morocco, in Western Sahara and the rest of Morocco. And then finally, we see it both as a platform for achieving a measure of governance in circumstances of state collapse, as in Libya, Yemen, and parts of Syria, and as a framework for reconstituting the state following conflict and collapse, as in post-2005 Iraq, and potentially looking to the future in Syria or Yemen. And with that, let me turn back to Asla to bring us home.
Yeah, and so this is really just now underscoring some of the things that Omar mentioned that are core takeaways in our view in terms of insights relating to some of these 6 types that we identify of drivers that produce a typology of forms of decentralization and federalism that we encounter in the region. The first is, and I mean here I think it's just important to underscore again that decentralization, incredibly widely advocated for this region by international financial institutions and others as a means of achieving improvements in governance. And what we find is the limited efficacy of decentralization as a means of preventing authoritarian reversion. Here we see in Iraq, Tunisia, and Yemen, and all 3, a variety of approaches taken from entrenching constitutional formulae to adopting inclusive negotiating processes to having a kind of supervised constitutional process, distilling what had been decades of bargaining in the Iraqi context. In each of these, notwithstanding these past, decentralization has not served as a mechanism for preventing authoritarian reversion, and that there's a very significant risk that decentralization, particularly when it is led by executive actors and takes the form of deconcentration or political decentralization coupled with deconcentration, and I'd be happy, we'd I think both be happy to talk about this particular insight, that there's a real risk that decentralization actually facilitates authoritarian upgrading, as we call it in the region. That is, that authoritarian regimes have been very adept at capturing decentralizing processes, presenting them as measures of improved governance, and actually using them to consolidate their own control. And this has also been true in what we describe as imperial contexts, where the language of decentralization is repurposed in the context of Morocco, Western Sahara, to consolidate Rabat's control over Western Sahara, or in the Oslo context to essentially divert the possibility of self-determination for the Palestinians. And then finally, that federalism, which has long been treated, and here I say this with caution, because it's an overused concept, but it has been used as an F word, let's just say, in the region, that is, as something that is genuinely anathema to many of the regions of the region. So on the one hand, we have decentralizing reforms systematically advocated and failing to deliver in our view. And on the other hand, federalism is seldom attempted in the region and treated as anathema, and yet we believe, based on the cases that we've looked at, that it is in fact an urgent agenda item at a time of de facto territorial pluralism amidst civil conflict for a range of countries, beginning with Syria, Yemen, and Libya. Arguably, I would add Iraq to this list, which is nominally federal, but really only at the moment has a form of asymmetric federalism for Kurdistan. And so we view territorial pluralism, encompassing ideas of federalism and confederalism, as perhaps the only means of going forward within existing territorial borders with a measure of some degree of stability and improved governance. In terms of processes and instruments of decentralization, as Omar mentioned, we've resisted the urge to distill policy recommendations from, first of all, what remains very much a nascent process across the region. What we've been looking at are, a decade to 2-decade-old processes for most cases, apart from Iraq and Iran. But the cases we think do yield a series of generalizable insights, specifically that decentralization is far less likely to advance democratization where you have executive institutions leading the process and where the processes of crafting such reforms are not inclusive, which again is oftentimes the case across the region. In contexts like these in the MENA region, we find that decentralizing reforms should be understood to take a very long time. So this turns back to the point that Omar made about the extensive sort of requirement of processes that have to unfold over periods of time for two reasons. First, because the bargaining itself requires finding some kind of a balance amongst the interests of actors from the local to the central state, but also because capacity building is necessary in the context of enormous executive concentrations of power in the region, in the central government, if you mean to meaningfully stand up any form of decentralization. And that constitutional entrenchment, which is a strategy that has been tried in several instances in the region, may indeed be necessary. So this is one way, for example, to protect a process that will be a long-durée process that requires meaningful capacity building at the periphery, but it is not adequate to ensure the durability of these measures. We've seen in more than one instance in the region, constitutional entrenchment fail to deliver a meaningful, long-standing, durable commitment to decentralization. So as a set of concluding observations, I think we would say that decentralizing measures are clearly highly contingent. Our study highlights the dangers of generalizing and the importance of context in thinking through what decentralization can deliver. But in some of the countries our study covers, Syria and Kurdistan, Yemen, Israel, Palestine, it is difficult to conceive of a durable political settlement that does not involve some measure of territorial pluralism. And so I guess we'll conclude with this irony that decentralization seems to have one of the worst records of achieving the thing that it is most often recommended for, namely governance reform. Whereas in the arena where it presents the most potential, which is offering solutions to the identity conflicts that plague the region, it has long been treated as anathema and therefore taken off the table and deserves very much to be recognized as an urgent agenda item to be engaged, both within the region and internationally. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much for these insightful presentations, Asla and Omar. Now, Professor Jackson, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to comment on this truly outstanding collection, which offers great insights into constitutional arrangements in a variety of seldom studied systems in the Middle East and North Africa. The book is distinctive insofar as it combines some terrific general theory chapters and detailed case studies, so you can work back and forth between them, and a marvelous synthetic conclusion by the co-authors. It not only brings attention to a very important part of the world, which has been undergoing highly significant changes, but the work more generally, I think, expands our understandings of both decentralization and federalism. And in my talk, I'm going to reflect a little bit on my own work, which has mostly on federalism been about the United States. And I do so in tribute to the valuable contributions to the study of comparative federalism and decentralization that this work contributes. One of the abiding themes in the book, as you've heard, is its focus on who the actors are and what are their motivations in arranging decentralization or other kinds of constitutional arrangements. The book considers a very wide range of actors within the government, outside the government, subnational, central, executive, legislatures, NGOs, the general public, international organizations, both public and private. Interestingly, there's very little on courts, which may simply reflect their relative absence from governance and public law. And I want to mention a student of mine, very nearing completion of an SJD named Fadi Khoury, who is doing interesting thinking about the role courts might play in very divided societies. Now, in my own work, I have written that in contrast to some of the more idealized conceptions of federalism that one sees in the US literature, I've written that federal systems must be understood as reflecting historically situated and contingent compromises that reflect, at least in important part, the political interests of those who have the power to influence, strike, or enforce a bargain. And I think this perspective that I've tried to introduce in my own work is very much in tune with what we have learned from this volume. So back in the 1780s, a major part of the events driving the US Constitution were disputes between representatives of big states and small states, and representatives of slaveholding states and non-slaveholding states, and those concerned with a longer term perspective of nation building, and those concerned with what's my state gonna get. Now, for the rest of my time, I'm going to talk hopefully about three things. I can leave off the last two if I run out of time. And the first will be, and primarily will be, the nature of what I'm going to call constitutional bargains about decentralization and federalism, and the absolute need, you've already heard this morning, for a very contextual analysis of these arrangements. If time permits, I may then say something about the relationship between democracy, federalism, and effective government. And finally, I may say, again, if time permits, more about why this book is important for areas beyond its immediate region. All right, on the first, contextualized analysis of federalism and decentralization. To repeat the first point, if you don't know the players and their power positions and interests, you cannot make sense out of constitution making in general, and in particular approaches to federalism or decentralization. I'm going to quote the authors. You need to know what kind of actors are driving decentralization. Are they insiders or outsiders? Are they trying actually to devolve authority, or rather to consolidate central authority? How much bargaining power do they have? Now, I already mentioned the founding period of the current US Constitution. There were later amendments after the American Civil War in the 1860s and 1870s. These amendments could have been much more transformative than they were. When this new constitutional bargain is restruck, there was wide consensus on the abolition of slavery as such, and that stuck. But there was not the same level of agreement on fundamental issues of equality across all realms. And this is reflected in the highly contested provisions of some other amendments. There were no women at the bargaining table at this time, and almost no people of color. Women's equality barely surfaced, and when it did, it was often at the expense of claims of racial equality. So perhaps not surprising that these amendments were not more transformational, illustrating a central point of this wonderful book, which is the need to keep your eye on who the actors are. All right, second insight that I love, no stasis. Federal systems, decentralized systems are almost always dynamic. They have at least the seeds of dynamism to move towards greater central power or greater decentralization. So in describing shifts in Iraq and Lebanon in recent decades, the authors refer to reconstitutive decentralization, but similar observations might apply to the so-called classic federalisms. So some US justices say that American federalism has not changed for 2 centuries. They're wrong. The arena understood as subject to central control has expanded dramatically, with dramatic effects on the scope of legislative jurisdiction. Some justices are now trying, as 70 years ago other justices tried, to roll this back. But you see that dynamism even in the so-called classic federalisms. Third point that I love, there is no such thing as a blank slate. Every place has a history, colonial history, past conflicts, past constitutions, which are present in the minds of those who draft and agree to and try to implement newer governance arrangements. Jason Mazzone has a form of scholarship calling some of this interconstitutionalism, the impact of prior constitutions on later ones. But this is just an instance of a much more general phenomena reflecting the importance of history. And I do wonder, and the authors are commendably cautious about general policy prescriptions, and I think wisely so, because the no blank slate phenomena means that particular provisions or solutions will always be received and may well function very differently, depending on those past histories that filled up part of the slate. Fourth, again, on the importance of understanding motivations, much of the literature on the so-called classic federalisms, US, Australia, and whatnot, have a set of assumptions about what the purposes are. They protect liberty, they promote economic growth, and so forth. But as the Chowdhury and Hume chapter, I think in this book says, in post-conflict situations, that's not at all what federalism is about. It's about finding ways for people who experience their ethnicity or race or language as very different to live together without killing each other. I mean, that is a much more basic kind of purpose, and you have to keep that motivation in mind in figuring out what is going to hopefully work best in a particular setting. Fifth point is about what I would call the challenges of bilegalism, by which I mean understanding the conceptual vocabularies that are used and how the same words may mean different things in different contexts. And the authors do a fabulous job of developing this around multiple uses of decentralization. I'm going to quote from their closing chapter. Decentralization may be a bulwark against authoritarianism and a strategy for consolidating it. We heard that in one of the opening talks. It may be a vehicle for emancipation or a diversion from meaningful self-determination. So we can see the same word, decentralization, being used at a formal level. It may look similar, but actually a very, very different phenomena. This study brings out the importance, as you heard the authors speak openly, between center-led so-called decentralizations or deconcentrations that further concentrate the power of central government, as in Syria, and more genuine versions of decentralization, in which there's actually something that looks like local democratic self-government happening, as in the Kurdish areas in Turkey and Syria, under the influence of Öcalan, if I'm saying that right, philosophy of democratic confederalism. And in distinguishing these two possibilities, I took away from the study not only who's leading the effort to reform, but who is selecting the local leaders? Are they being appointed from the center, or are you having local participatory decision-making processes? Sixth point, if I still have time, there's the old law in the books, law in action contrast that emerges in several of the studies, for example, on the Iraqi constitution, or in Syria, failure to implement key provisions of Law 107. But even on this point, context matters, and the distance between law in the books and law in action may not always be negative. I'm thinking here of the description by Mesnan and Miller in Libya of how municipal councils have pursued revenue generation through various schemes, essentially ignoring restrictions on their ability to directly collect fees to fund services, but thereby becoming more effective and responsive to the needs of their people. All right, seventh point, and Professor Dejani talked about this, as did both professors did. Again, we're back to sort of the conceptual vocabulary point. In the US, federalism has a more or less positive connotation. People debate about it. But that word has been an F word, not only in the region you've written about, but in the EU. You know, you're not supposed to talk about the EU as a federal system. And having read this volume, I feel like I have a deeper understanding of why, that the connotations of federalism are about secession. They're about dismemberment. And in the MENA region of the world, it's about imposed lines of dismemberment and divide and conquer strategies. Now, the same thing can be said, but maybe to a lesser degree, about decentralization. But I really came away with a much stronger understanding. Okay, I think my last point in this part of my talk, and then the moderator will tell me if I should go on. I was humbled as I read more about the development of the idea of democratic confederalism and its spread in Turkey and parts of Syria, parts of Turkey, parts of Syria. I was struck by the idea that words and ideas matter. in ways that sometimes the more political science oriented among us may not appreciate. But this seemed to me to be a story about a reconceptualization of an idea that is then attracts adherents, it persuades, and is put into practice in ways that offer arguably a pretty positive understanding of the possibilities. All right, do I have time to do 2 other points, moderator?
Yeah, just briefly.
Okay, I'm sorry, I wasn't keeping track myself. Okay, the second larger point is about the importance of studying effectiveness in government as part of studying constitutions and constitutionalism and democracy. So I was very struck in the Libya chapter about how the absence of effective government meant that elections couldn't be held on time. And then even when elections were held, what was it, 20 different jurisdictions actually couldn't do it. So democracy needs government to be effective. And sometimes people oppose effective government to rights. And I want to say, no, actually, sometimes effective government is necessary to support rights. And sometimes a federal approach may actually be necessary if you're in a large polity or an ethnically riven polity, may be necessary in order to enable governments to be effective. And then my very last point about further implications beyond the region, I'll just very briefly say that the apparent stability of the United States system since the Civil War, I think, is only apparent. The insight about dynamism and stasis is an important one, and dynamism does not always go in positive directions, as we've seen in these studies. No country can assume it will only move in good progressive directions, and the US may find itself in need of the theorizing informed by experience with democratic confederalism as trust in our national government begins to decline. And scholars like Mark Tushnet, in his recent book on fourth branch institutions, end the book by saying it's not clear that institutions at the center can solve problems. You may need more what he called radical decentralization of decision making, and the discussion in this book will contribute, I think, further to discussions not only about MENA but in the U.S. and other classical federalisms. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think there will be more time in the Q&A session, so we could further engage with those ideas. Now, Professor Khosla, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. And obviously, I'm hugely sort of privileged to be here, and I learned a huge amount. I wanted to sort of just begin by saying what I thought was in some ways among the most important contributions of the book. And some of this has, of course, already been noted because they're so vivid. So I think this is a historical moment, just stepping out of the MENA region, where genuinely we're seeing a debate in comparative constitutional law around federalism, centralization, decentralization in a range of contexts. And just to mention 3, one is Hong Kong and the Chinese mainland. One is actually the EU and the nature of sort of supranational sort of arrangements, call them federal or call them don't. I think actually in certain countries like India, it's very interesting that you have sort of different kinds of realignments of centralized and decentralized power. And I think in many ways, the increasing polarization in the US and the fact that, you know, we are now in a country where you can have radically different kinds of freedoms and arrangements in different states is also really opening up the sort of question of what federalism means and demands and centralization and decentralization mean. And so I think in that context, this is just a really important contribution. I think some of the arguments that we find in the book may seem around centralization, decentralization may seem familiar, such as improving government, identity-based management, or arguments about development, security, so on and so forth. I think what's remarkable in the book is how these familiar arguments play out in a completely unfamiliar region. And the region is unfamiliar in two ways, I think, that are most notable. One is that it's largely non-democratic, and the second is that it's beset with internal conflicts. And these are societies, as the Anderson Chaudhary chapter really tries to work with, that are dealing with fragmentation in a very deep way. And what these two features lead to are very different incentive structures and practical possibilities for decentralization. In a way that that Vicky captured, I think the third thing about the book that I really enjoyed was how it not only sort of helps you think through the dynamic between centralization and decentralization, or federalism and a unitary state, but also the varieties of decentralization. And so in Asla's chapter on the Turkish Kurdistan, you see the sort of working through of administrative decentralization, fiscal decentralization, political decentralization. And I think one of the interesting things going forward will be to see not whether or how, well, not whether one decentralizes, but actually the axes around which you actually can have a highly centralized policy that's deeply polity that's deeply decentralized in some ways, and vice versa. In terms of sort of the insights, and it's deeply reductive to sort of point out three, 4, 5 insights from a 500-page book where every page sort of has something profound to offer. But to me, among the things that I sort of read and reread and that sort of stayed with me, one was that the book in a way is covering the recent past, but in some way it's covering the slightly longer history. I want to think of the second half of the 20th century, right? The sort of impact of that in some ways. And if we just step back and contrast it with the first half of the 20th century, among the most interesting things is actually how that first half was deeply invested in political pluralism across different kinds of regions and societies. And at the end of the Second World War, you see a number of proposals for confederations, for plural arrangements, so on and so forth. But in a way, the nation state wins. And the nation state sort of wins in a major way. And I think part of what the book left me with is that one has to negotiate, in some sense, the inescapability of the nation state. And in a way, the current battles, whether in Hong Kong, whether over Brexit, whether over in whatever form, do they in some sense just involve a sort of reassertion and a reworking of that history? And so that was one sort of dynamic that I thought, just placing it sort of in a longer trajectory. The second is to place it in an even longer trajectory. I think it's and in this, I mean, I can really see why the book is so right on this, that in some sense, power, the decentralization or the centralization of power, or forms of arrangements where power is split across hierarchical mediums, for us who work mainly in countries with democratic constitutionalism, seems in many ways like a fine idea. But when I read this book, I was actually reminded of the British Empire, which basically was a model of constitutional government where power was actually divided with astonishing complexity across not horizontal but vertical lines. And in some sense, the British Empire is, for us in the modern world, the paradigmatic non-democratic constitutional arrangement. And so I sort of was looking at some of these chapters and was thinking about that. And I think one of the most significant contributions of the chapter, one of the most significant contributions of the book is that it actually, although it's a book about what is largely a non-democratic region, it moves beyond the dichotomy between democratic and non-democratic very neatly. And so, Sam Huntington once said that the real distinction between countries is not the form of government, but the extent of government. And you see this across the book. You see it in sort of the Kian Tajbash chapter on Iran. You see it in several others. And there's a way in which some of the contemporary comparative constitutional law literature on populism has very nicely brought out how some of the traditional structural features of constitutional law may actually have nothing to do with democratic constitutionalism. And so you can have that form, quote unquote, but you may actually have a very different regime type. And that argument has been made primarily in the context of separation of powers. So you can have courts, most notably. You can have functioning judiciary, so on and so forth. But it's not really been made in the federal context. And it's not really been made in the federal context because part of what's interesting in these populist regimes is, barring a few, most of them are not federal states. But actually, this book, to me, for me, connected very neatly with that broader literature, because we sort of teach and imbibe constitutional law, democratic constitutionalism, as being about federalism, being about separation of powers, and actually, you may think none of these actually have to do with democratic constitutionalism. And so I think the book is a real opportunity to actually think more deeply about the relationship between structural features of democratic constitutionalism and authoritarian constitutionalism more broadly, and to sort of get a sense of that. I think one of the things that I think a third insight in some way is, and this is related to the design point, is it sort of leaves you thinking that you may actually come to the conclusion that in states, what's truly important is not actually the distinction between centralization and decentralization, but the distribution of political power. And in a way, in these states, when you see attempts for actually certain kinds of political mobilization, what appears to be in the background is not so much a desire for a particular design form, but actually a way in which to reorient the distribution of power in some sense. And I think that was sort of one sort of link that played out. The fourth insight that I was sort of thinking about was on the identity question. And I think the identity question is an interesting one, because one of the things that I think is worth thinking about in the book is actually how the identity question may end up turning a little bit on what kinds of identities we are actually interested in. And I think the Kimlicka chapter gets at that a little bit. And here, I think the South Asian example is interesting, right? Because on the one hand, part of the nature of Jinnah's politics at partition was that it ultimately, his claim for representation was necessarily going to be territorialized, because because the ultimate thought was that minorities could only find security in an arrangement where they would become a majority. And you actually couldn't constitute a politics on other terms. And so therefore you lead effectively to a kind of secession. On the other hand, you see a very different kind of politics in post-independent India, which is also around identity, which has actually been hugely successful, which is the complete redrawing of India's internal boundaries on language. And the language question has actually enabled the country to diffuse a number of political tensions. And I don't know how much of that has to do with the form of identity, whether some of them can get cast and recast as minority, majority, and others can't. But I think that's sort of one thought that I was actually sort of thinking about. I had two sort of thoughts on thinking about how this book would would help us and force us and encourage us to actually think about decentralization, centralization, and federalism elsewhere in terms of how it works out. And I think the first is that one of the things that, because of the book's region, that it interestingly doesn't involve, but some of the other countries that we typically study in comparative constitutionalism do, is the relationship between the vertical division of power and political competition. That actually, and that's a separate point from the distribution of political power, to what, because you actually need elections at multiple levels of government. To what extent is centralization, decentralization, federalism actually a way to encourage and to enable political competition? And I think part of the failure of studies on democratic constitutionalism is that the relationship between political competition and all these other things we think of in federalism, governance, distribution of power, is all blurred. And the book helps us sort of take political competition out of the sort of mix and say, look, all these things can still happen and you can think about it. Now, there's obviously because there isn't political competition, I don't mean to suggest there isn't politics. Of course there is, right? There's politics and there's a background political theory, and these are deeply political societies in the best and most important sense of the word. But I only mean the very technical point about literally elections at multiple levels. I think the second is that I think it would be worth thinking about to what extent actually some of these dynamics end up or are shaped in some way by a kind of external geopolitical and global kind of power arrangement, and to what extent that actually pressurizes and depressurizes the kind of sort of federal story or decentralized story that we end up with, which I saw less of in the book, but I think that's a sort of big thing going forward. I had two, and I'll sort of end with this. I had two sort of questions because the book is so profoundly erudite that I thought I'll exploit this event to get more information out of Asla and Omar, which is one, I think one feature that I found less in the book, but I found a lot in 20th century debates, when in mid 20th century debates, when sort of the nation state won, was in some sense the thought that actually confederations or vertical distributions of power are fiscally impossible. That actually, as a pure fiscal model, they just don't work. And so in part, you need massive centralization because and I was wondering to what extent you both saw fiscal arguments or arguments basically about that kind of thing appear, and like who was sort of appropriating them and presenting them and so on and so forth. And the second is, I think you both in the book make a really sort of subtle and important distinction between federalism and decentralization. But I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, because there is a way in which in certain kinds of literatures, people actually think of both as actually alternatives to a unitary state and just actually as forms of vertical separation, as a sort of separation, some kind of vertical distribution of power, where actually that's not the main. And I think you're absolutely right. And I think that the implications for secessionism and all, so it's not sort of to disagree at all, but it's just to sort of pose that as that contrast, rather than the centralization versus decentralization contrast or the federalism versus unitary contrast. How should we actually think about the federalism versus decentralization contrast? Okay, I'm going to stop there because I could go on forever, but I mean, the most important thing I have to say is thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for these wonderful insights. Now, there are many questions, and I think you may have to pick and choose some of them. And if you could do so like in 10 minutes, 5 for Omar and 5 for Asla, that would be great. Then we will have some time for Q&A, and then we could also develop those questions further.
Omar, did you want to go first?
Please go ahead. Go ahead, Asla. Thank you.
Okay. You'd like me to go ahead? Okay, so then I would, I think I might connect a question or observation that Vicky gave on specifically around the idea of democratic confederalism and and this idea of dynamism and what lessons might the US actually, or other broader comparisons, but even in the United States, might we take from looking at this, and connect that to a point that Madhav also made around the kind of longer history, thinking back to the second half of the 20th century and investments in political pluralism. Is there a reassertion here of history and a reworking of the idea of the nation state that's present? And I think both of those things nicely converge in a sense. So to my own mind, it's not only deeply divided societies like those in the Middle East, but basically all nation states that construct permanent majorities and minorities, empowered insiders and subordinated others. And so efforts that we're tracking in the Middle East to grapple with pluralism are important because they address broader lessons in addressing the pathologies that emerge from the nation state. The actual idea that you're going to have some kind of ethno-national majority have disproportionate control over the levers of state power, which of course those pathologies are of systemic discrimination, and that has been unleashed by the dynamics of the nation state, surely, of course, in the Middle East, but very clearly elsewhere, and in the United States in particular, it's been in sharp relief in recent years. So when we think about what are the ways that we might draw broader lessons from, for example, democratic confederalism, the idea of trying to solve challenges around the empowerment of minorities, and this also touches on one of the points that Madhav was making at the end. I think there is a great deal to learn about the idea that federalism can serve, and of course, in a even more broadly, confederalism in the context of Öcalan can serve as a way, as a model for thinking about to what extent do we allow the idea, the animating idea of laboratories of participation or experimentation with political engagement actually unfold in any of the states of the established, federal or democratic systems in the global north. It's actually to an extraordinarily limited degree. I mean, the idea of having, there's a way in which Öcalan's ideas almost harken back to a sort of idea of town halls and participation that's Tocquevillian and sounds nostalgic and romantic and impractical. And what we're reminded of on the ground is actually it's conceivable that one could organize and be effective at the council level. One could imagine towns and municipalities and other very small subnational units meaningfully contributing in some way to conceptions of policymaking in ways that have some of the best features that one hopes for in federalism. So, for example, ideas about the ways that federalism can allow policy experimentation that allows minorities to become more visible, to have places and spaces in which their preferences actually form a majority within a particular pocket that then feeds into other forms of political competition. So I do think, I just want to underscore that we believe in undertaking this work, that contrary to treatments of the Middle East and North Africa as both idiosyncratic and pathological, that it can neither be, there's nothing generative or generalizable to be learned from studying a region like this one, that quite to the contrary, there are important lessons to be learned here about how to grapple with pluralism that are absolutely applicable to both settled and advanced democracies that are grappling with very much similar questions, and also just more generally. I mean, I think that resonances in the global south are apparent, but I really appreciate, Vicky, that you underscored the possibility of meaningful lessons to be drawn here also for countries like the United States. The other thought I had, and this I think connects again to one of Madhav's closing points, is that what we come away with from our reading is that rather than thinking about whether decentralization is good or bad policy, good or bad for development, good or bad for democratization, good or bad for conflict resolution, we came away with a strong view that this is a mistaken framing, and that instead one has to understand that there is no alternative to decentralization. It is already occurring de facto in much of the region because of demands from below, whether the de jure framework allows it or not. And so the question really is the one that Vicky, you pointed to by your emphasis on context, and Madhav, that you raised just a moment ago, which is not whether to decentralize, but how decentralization may best be designed. So this kind of gets us out of the constant loop of whether to decentralize, whether federalist or territorial plural arrangements are necessary. We're saying counterintuitively that territorial pluralism may offer the best means of preserving territorial integrity for many of the states of the region, and similarly that some version of decentralized capacity building is necessary for any measure of meaningful governance to be achieved. So then I guess the last thing I'll say in my 5 minutes is on the fiscal point, I think there is one example that clearly addresses both the fiscal question and the question about political competition that you raised, Madhav, which is Iran, ironically, right? So again, we think of in these non-democratic contexts of a country like Iran as just a story of authoritarian decentralization. But actually, there are incredibly interesting, subtle lessons to be learned in that chapter, one of which is that authoritarian decentralization that isn't necessarily led from the top. So there's meaningful competition in two ways in Iran that the chapter illustrates. First, there's competition amongst different groups within the central government. Those that are absolutely believing, Velayat theocrats who want decentralization only to the extent that it's going to solidify the regime's ideological hold, technocrats who believe that the regime to survive has to deliver more effective governance at some level. So it's a regime survival strategy still designed for authoritarian purposes. And then actual reformists, liberal reformists who think that decentralization may be a way to generate experiments that will eventually lead to democratization. All three of these competing ideas and blocks and literal actors and parties are involved in engineering the design. So there's that kind of competition, but they actually produce a design that involves meaningful electoral competition, actual political competition, competitive elections at the local and municipal level in Iran that have themselves been very interesting and have done one thing that I think really has to be underscored in a region that is both non-democratic and largely authoritarian like the Middle East. They ended up delivering non-trivial benefits in terms of actual improvements in governance. And that, in urban planning, in the provision of municipal services, in responsiveness to constituents, they also facilitated what the Velayat theocrats wanted more than anything else. They facilitated the ideological penetration of the regime in the periphery. So they simultaneously ended up consolidating authoritarianism, undermining the hopes of political liberalization that decentralization might enable, but achieving competitive elections at some level and improving governance. Now that's a conundrum that's really worth thinking about. And this is I'm going to stop here, but this is where context matters so greatly. It's not the absence of competition. It's that we have these kinds of, black and white conceptions of what it is that a particular regime or a particular set of institutions might be providing. And we just tell very unsubtle stories, I think, about different countries in the region. And so whether it's attending to actual experiments in governance that are taking place in places that are seen as wastelands for any kind of theoretical or empirical study, like Yemen in the midst of the civil conflict, like Libya in a circumstance where there is no central government. The headline stories occlude our ability to actually observe incredibly interesting phenomena that are taking place across the region, and also ones that really, I think, put real pressure on some of the generalizations we make about how, for example, as the context of Iran that I just mentioned, authoritarian decentralization might work. Here's an example where it works both to deliver improved governance and does facilitate some measure of electoral competition, while actually still, nonetheless, consolidating authoritarianism. I think that's just an interesting thing to observe as we try to think through, well, what lessons does this hold for our broader set of theories? Omar.
Thanks very much, Asla, and thanks so much, Vicky and Madhav, for your comments. It's really energizing to be in conversation with you, truly. I want to just touch on three things that, like Asla's comments, maybe link together some of your own comments and questions. So I'll start with the point that Madhav raised at the end, the distinction between federalism, decentralization, and that is something that we struggled with a little bit to consider how to engage the fact that whereas in the literature there's sort of a, maybe not a bright line, but a fuzzy line distinguishing federal from unitary states, and the classic definitions point to the entrenchment of authority in the Constitution and the extent to which subnational entities are represented in the government, choose their own representatives in national government, and also to some extent just how deep their authority in a set of particular areas was. But what we found was that as we looked certainly at federal systems, few as they are in the Middle East, and at some of the models that Middle Eastern countries were turning to, was that this line was not as robust or as frankly important as we thought it was at the outset. That understanding there to be a continuum that involved devolution of a range of different kinds of powers, and that parties bargained across that continuum, going back and forth in their offers and responses. That, to our mind, really vindicated this choice of looking at these things together, even as we tried to identify the ways in which the choice between them could be significant. And on that front, we think that the chapter that Wilkin Licka offered provided a really important kind of rejoinder to some of our early, Asla and I initially were saying, oh, well, maybe some of these alternatives to federalism could be really useful ways of dealing with the disempowerment of minorities in heterogeneous states. And Will said, be careful, drawing in part to your point, Vicky, on the US experience, but also looking closely at some of the cases that were being discussed at the two conferences that we held, and saying, even though we can sketch these along a continuum, at the end of the day, where you end up, the deal that you strike does have consequences. And that was, I think, powerful for us to keep in mind. Second point, we were struck as we looked at the longer history and at the short-term history, not only at how long the bargaining process was that unfolded, but how radically the bargaining positions of different actors changed over time. And that ended up being really significant in our analysis of how inevitable it is that federalism, or at least robust decentralization, become a part of the agenda for addressing the future of some of the states that are part of our survey. When we saw the shift in the ways in which Southern Yemenis, in the ways in which Syrian Kurds, and conversely, in the ways in which Sahrawis understood their position, when we saw this shift from contemplating fairly limited autonomy to having control over territory to demanding a robust federalism, it struck us not only how significant control over territory is in terms of what a party's bargaining position is likely to be, but also how far in the period that we're studying, how far the terms of bargains have necessarily shifted. And it's terrible to say about people's lives. It'll be interesting to see what unfolds, but it'll be very, very interesting in Syria and in Yemen and in Libya to see how the discourse changes in the coming years. Very last point, Madhav, I was struck by the point that you made about the resilience, the inescapability of the nation state as a reference point. And, Asla and I both come to this with a bit of resentment toward the nation state's distortion of a region that we both treasure, and the ways in which it blanches out the cosmopolitanism that was in many ways its distinguishing characteristic. One of the things that is interesting is the question of whether some of the kinds of formations that we're exploring have the possibility to not only accommodate differences in identity, but to actually shift our conception of identity in meaningful ways. And that's where, Vicky, your point about the power of democratic confederalism to change the way people see what politics is capable of is really interesting. And although when we presented this at a seminar that we both participate in, that Yale Law School puts on, we got some hard reactions from folks saying, oh, over-idealized democratic confederalism. But to our minds, one of the things that is very interesting that's unfolding is the possibility of a shift in identity, the possibility of a decentering of the nation in a context where it has played such a destructive role. And maybe Mahmoud Bandani would say that every part of the world is a context in which the nation state has played a destructive role, but we've certainly seen that in the Middle East. So we are interested in the ways in which some of these political arrangements might, if constructed properly, shift the way in which a nation and national identity in particular gets conceived.
Yeah, thank you so much, Asla and Omar, for your precise responses to these questions. Now we will open the floor for the audience. If you have any questions or comments, you can ask them. They have all the answers. Yeah, and until they are thinking about what they may ask, I may simply pick up at least 2 points from Vicky and Madhav. The first one is, I think that in post-colonial states, both in MENA and other regions, there is a resistance towards federalism, right? And there are, and in the book you provide, detailed explanation why this is so. I was wondering, there are many political, social, and cultural issues. But I was wondering, what do you think is the impact of geography or size in terms of, the resistance towards federalism in those post-colonial states? And the second one is related to decentralization. I think Vicky was talking about it extensively. So in the book, you talk about the different drivers of decentralization and the different functions they serve. So my question to you is, whether we should evaluate the success or failure, whether there are these things of decentralization or federalism based on the constitutionalism or the practice of liberal democracy. Do you think we could learn something different from the region if we, for example, think about decentralization with their intended purpose and function? Do you think there are some success stories without or beyond constitutionalism and liberal democracy?
Omar, do you want to go first?
Would you like for me to?
I'm indifferent.
I'm happy to take a shot at the first of those questions. In the U.S. context, of course, federalism gets set forward as a response in part to the size of the republic. Madison's vision is size makes something like a federal scheme absolutely crucial. I think that if I consider the sources of resistance to federalism in the region, to my mind, it is a function less of geography than of the relative weakness of the states that are in place. I think that it is the regime's sense of their vulnerability that makes them respond so harshly to suggestions of federalism. That said, I think, and I'd have to look at the map to give you a good answer to this, I think that it's probably in the places where regions are most severable geographically from the states of which they're part, that the reactions against federalism are strongest, that where the sense is that secession is most feasible. And so I think that's possibly part of the reason why we see the reaction that we do we saw some of the reaction we did both in Yemen and the Kurdish areas of Syria is because of geographic difference, but because of the overlay with ethnic difference, it's hard for me to distinguish geography from those other factors. Asla, do you have a better answer to that?
So I think you've nailed it in terms of just the concerns with federalism are entirely about the possibilities of secession. And so if geography in any way contributes to that, if there's a geographical or topographical feature that makes it likelier that a particular region is distinctive or has a resource concentration that means that secession becomes viable, then anxieties about federalism are far, far greater. And that could be in a very small or a very large regional context. So in a large regional context like Saudi Arabia, concerns about the Eastern Province, which is extremely resource rich, are drivers of an anxiety about federalism, certainly. But also in very small countries, or countries that are medium-sized, like a country like Libya, which has both a medium-sized population and a medium-sized, let's say, geography, where it's not really necessarily about resource concentration. There's nonetheless substantial geographic variety between coastal regions, resource distribution across the coast, and then the interior region. So it does seem to me that there's some relationship to geography making the idea of a version of partition viable that makes federalism more intensely undesirable. But as we point out in the book, Tunisia felt the need, a country with very little geographic diversity. I mean, there's interior and coastal, but it's a quite homogenous country, homogenous ethnically, small population size. Despite all of these things, they felt the need in drafting a new constitution to underscore the unitary identity of the Tunisian state, because even in that context, these post-colonial anxieties that I think are driven by the kind of path-dependent history that we told remain pronounced. And so at a time when they were embracing governance-based decentralization, they felt the need to strongly signal that this in no way should be confused with federalism, which suggests that even in the absence of either ethnic or geographic diversity, this region expresses a continued anxiety about the idea of federalism. And then on the second of your questions, Berihun, I think the point that Madhav made really carries forward, which is that we are looking at largely non-democratic countries in which nonetheless the debates about possible benefits and incentives for decentralization are pronounced. And so it is clear that the success and failure around the motivations and the goals and the identity of the actors is distinct in some ways from liberal democratic criteria for success and failure, given the nature of the regimes, even if in some instances, even in many instances, the goals include moving in the direction of political liberalism, that they're not coterminous with that by any stretch. And so again, I'll just point for ease of reference to Iran, because I mentioned it earlier, there is an example where one could easily speak of the success or failure of the decentralizing model that was adopted, and one can speak of meaningful successes in a context not only of a non-democratic, non-politically liberalized regime, but even in a regime where indeed, I think decentralization did facilitate a degree of authoritarian consolidation, and nonetheless, we can speak about a kind of success, which is, as I say, the non-trivial benefit. And that non-trivial benefit, by the way, tying back to Madhav's original question, entailed fiscal decentralization, Madhav. So there was indeed talk of resources, and talk of resources is important in many of these cases. In Tunisia, for example, the failure to imagine fiscal redistribution anytime before a quarter century of negotiation and capacity building at the local level was one of the problems, very substantial problems, that the remnant bureaucracy of the ancien regime posed to the possibility of meaningfully realizing the decentralizing ambitions of the constitutional order there. I'm mindful of time. Yeah.
Yeah. So Vicky and Madhav, if you have any pressing issues or questions, I think we could talk about them.
I'll just say I have to leave because I had this book for an hour and a half. I think we're there. But I think the fiscal question also concerned me, because one of the things central governments do is they even out resources, or they can do. And so the confederal model, I don't know how it speaks to that, but I also think some issues are more pressing at different times than others. So I'll look forward to learning more about that in the future. Thank you again. I'm going to sign off. Am I correct that we're near the end of our time here now?
Yes. So thank you so much. I think this was a great discussion, and we will upload the discussion on our YouTube channel, and I think many people would learn about the region and your book. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.